Hi guys. Tonight I want to take you on a long, quiet journey, one that drifts like a lantern across a wide and dark river of memory. We're going to step into the dusty boots of those who once set out across the American frontier, following a path known as the Oregon Trail. You may have heard of it before, maybe even played the game that made it famous in classrooms, but tonight we won't be playing. Instead, we'll walk slowly, carefully, and with a touch of reverence through the real story. A story of hardship, hunger, exhaustion, and endurance. A story that whispers to us across centuries and dares us to wonder if we, with all our modern comforts, would survive even a single day in their world. This isn't the tale of polished pioneers in neat wagons rolling across a painted prairie. It's the groan of wagon wheels, the rasp of breath in cold mountain passes, the bite of hunger when supplies run out, and the haunting silence of graves dug by the side of the trail. As we go, we'll find ourselves in the company of ordinary people, families, children, and wanderers, who abandoned everything familiar to chase a promise that waited far beyond the horizon. We'll meet them as they wrestle with illness, cross rivers that swallowed whole wagons, and cling desperately to a dream called Oregon. The truth is, you and I, dropped suddenly into that world, would probably never last a day. The weight of survival was relentless. But as we linger in their footsteps, moving slowly with the rise and fall of their story, we'll not only see how fragile life was, but also how fiercely determined it could be. Tonight, we're not rushing. We'll wander, as if sitting by a fire, letting the sparks rise into the still night air, thinking of what it might have been like to step off the edge of the known world and not look back. The Oregon Trail was not a single road, but a living artery of movement stretching nearly 2,000 miles. From Missouri to the Pacific, it cut across plains, rivers, deserts, and mountains. In the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, this route carried hundreds of thousands westward, though not all made it. For every wagon that rolled into the Willamette Valley, another story ended along the way. The grass grew over graves, the rivers swallowed possessions, and the trail itself became a kind of ghostly record of ambition and sorrow. Imagine it now. The first light of dawn glows faintly over Independence, Missouri. The year is 1846. Families gather nervously by their wagons. Oxen shuffle in the early chill, their breath steaming in the cold. Somewhere a baby cries, a sound quickly hushed. A mother tightens a bonnet string beneath her chin, while her husband checks the iron hoops of the wagon wheels one last time. Behind them lies everything they have known. Ahead stretches nothing but an uncertain road, and in that moment, they know there is no turning back. The Oregon Trail wasn't simply travelled, it was endured. The pace was dictated by the creak of wagon axles, the soft but steady plod of animals, and the fragile limits of human strength. At night, the stars above seemed endless, but so too were the miles yet to come. And every dawn brought a question that gnawed quietly in the mind. How much farther could we truly go? So tonight, in this first chapter of our long story, I want you to settle in and feel the slowness of it. Feel the weight of silence before the wagons rolled. Feel the mixture of fear and fragile hope. Because before the first wheel even left the mud of Missouri, each traveller had already made a choice most of us could never imagine. To risk it all for a promise of land, freedom, or simply survival. Let us walk with them then, into the dust. Let us feel the ground shake beneath hooves and wooden wheels. Let us hear the murmurs of goodbye whispered behind clenched teeth. And let us for tonight forget our soft beds, our steady lights, and our full cupboards. Let us wonder, truly wonder, whether we could last a single day in their world on that long and merciless road west. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, and though the sun had barely risen, the encampment was alive with movement. Wagons creaked as oxen strained against their yokes, the smell of damp earth rising with each push forward. For the emigrants, this first true step onto the Oregon Trail was not a simple departure. It was the unravelling of one life and the tentative stitching of another. The road ahead was not smooth. It was rough, rutted, uncertain, yet it beckoned like a silent promise. Children shuffled alongside wagons, their eyes wide with a blend of fear and excitement. Some clutched small keepsakes, tokens from homes they would never see again. Mothers checked supplies, flour, bacon, beans, salt and coffee, counting them as though the numbers could keep hunger forever at bay. Fathers, their hands already blistering from handling ropes and reins, scanned the horizon with guarded expressions. They knew that each choice they made, when to push forward, when to rest, how to ration, could mean the difference between life and death before the journey's end. As the wagons rolled slowly out of Independence, a hush seemed to fall. Behind them, civilization receded into memory, replaced by an open wilderness that spread endlessly in every direction. For many, this silence was unsettling. The noises of towns, the hammer on iron, the chatter of marketplaces, the ring of church bells were gone. In their place came the groan of timber, the shuffle of animals, and the occasional sharp cry of a teamster urging his oxen forward. The trail itself was narrow, worn by earlier travellers, and already the wheels sank into grooves carved by countless migrations before them. The first miles were deceptively gentle. Flat ground stretched across the Missouri River bottoms, and the wagons moved steadily, though never quickly. At most, a caravan could cover 15 miles in a long day, and more often it was less. This slow crawl was not simply frustrating, it was a constant reminder of fragility. Every step forward cost energy, food, and hope, and no amount of determination could make the journey shorter. The emigrants quickly learned that on the Oregon Trail, patience was not a virtue, it was survival. At midday, the sun grew harsher, beating down on canvas wagon covers that trapped heat like ovens. Families sought shade where they could, under sparse trees, beside shallow creeks. Meals were meagre, usually a strip of bacon or a handful of bread, washed down with warm water from barrels tied to wagon sides. There was no time for luxury, no pause for comfort. Every break had to be brief, every rest taken with one eye on the road and another on the dwindling supplies. By evening, camp was made in the tall grasses. Wagons were pulled into a rough circle, not for dramatic defense, as later legends would suggest, but simply to keep the animals from wandering and to create a sense of order in the vast wilderness. Fires crackled weakly, their smoke curling into the sky, while families huddled close, eating small portions and sharing quiet words. Children sometimes laughed, their resilience surprising, but for the adults the mood was heavier. Each face carried lines etched by worry, the fear of sickness, of storms, of rivers yet to cross. On this first night, as stars glittered above like scattered diamonds, a peculiar silence lingered. It was the silence of men and women realizing how far they had stepped from everything they knew. There were no inns, no doctors, no shops. If a wheel broke, it had to be fixed with what lay at hand. If someone fell ill, there was no guarantee of medicine, and if food ran short, there would be no miraculous resupply. Out here, the trail was both path and prison, carrying them forward but refusing to release them until the end. As families lay wrapped in thin blankets, the prairie wind whispered across the camp. It carried with it a chill that no fire could quite chase away, and in that chill lay the weight of truth. Every soul here had chosen this. The land behind them was gone, and the land ahead was only a dream. Between those two realities stretched thousands of miles of hardship. And though few spoke of it aloud, each understood the gamble. They might never see Oregon. They might not even see the next season. The children slept easily, dreaming of adventure, of rivers and mountains yet unseen. But the parents lay awake longer, staring at the endless sky. For them the stars did not promise wonder. They whispered of distance, of time, of struggle, and in the flickering glow of dying campfires, the thought pressed heavily on every mind. This was only the beginning. The hardest trials were still to come, and each dawn would carry with it new tests of endurance, courage, and faith. The prairie did not care for their hopes. It stretched vast and indifferent, waiting silently as it always had. And on that first night, as wolves howled faintly from the distance, the Oregon Trail revealed its first secret. Survival was not a matter of strength or boldness, but of quiet persistence. One step at a time, 1 mile at a time, 1 day at a time. And for those who could not endure even that, the trail itself would become their final resting place, marked only by a grave of stones along the roadside. By the third day on the trail, the first illusions had begun to break. The excitement that had carried many through the early miles now gave way to fatigue. The wagons creaked endlessly, their wooden wheels grinding against the rutted earth, each rotation wearing down both man and beast. Dust clung to every surface, clothes, skin, even food. It found its way into eyes and lungs, turning each breath into a small labor. The trail was teaching its first quiet lesson, that no journey of this scale could be romantic for long. Animals once spirited at the departure were already showing signs of strain. Oxen, though strong, were slow and stubborn. They trudged forward, heads bowed, pulling with steady determination, but offering no bursts of speed. Horses fared worse, tiring quickly under the weight of harnesses and heat, and mules, though hardy, tested tempers with their stubborn resistance. Families quickly discovered that caring for their animals was as important as caring for themselves. A wagon without a team was useless, and more than one family would later be forced to abandon prized possessions when beasts collapsed along the way. The rhythm of life on the trail was unyielding. Each morning began in the darkness, long before sunrise, with the soft stirring of camp. Fires were kindled from dwindling wood piles, and breakfast was prepared in haste, usually nothing more than biscuits, jerky, or coffee if supplies allowed. Then came the arduous task of yoking animals, packing wagons, and gathering children still half asleep. By the time the sun rose, the caravan was already in motion, a slow procession across an endless sea of prairie grass. There was little conversation during these hours. The soundscape of the trail was simple, the low murmur of animals, the occasional crack of a whip, the groaning of wagon frames under weight they were never built to carry. Men walked beside the wagons, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes scanning both the horizon and the ground ahead. Women tended to children, sometimes walking, sometimes perched on bouncing seats inside the wagons, their hands busy with sewing or mending. But for the most part, silence stretched long, broken only by commands barked at oxen or the soft complaints of weary children. The monotony was broken, not by joy but by challenge. Streams had to be forded, and even small creeks could become hazards. A wagon too heavy might tip, spilling supplies into the water. Families learned to strip down belongings before crossings, carrying bundles across by hand while animals were coaxed into the current. Sometimes the water rose higher than expected, sweeping away barrels, bedding, or worse. The river crossings reminded all that no part of the journey could be trusted. What looked shallow could prove deadly. What seemed calm could turn violent in moments. As the caravan pressed farther west, illness made its first appearance. A child coughed through the night, fever burning his cheeks. A mother whispered prayers, but there were no doctors here, no remedies beyond herbs, rest, and faith. Dysentery, cholera, and fevers lurked invisibly in every stream and campsite. Each drink of water could be a gamble, and as families watched their loved ones weaken, they realized how frail the human body could be when stripped of the safety nets of towns and medicine. Out here, the wilderness decided who would rise and who would fall. At camp that evening, fires flickered low. Supplies were already dwindling faster than many had planned. Barrels of flour seemed suddenly smaller, sacks of beans lighter. The long lists of goods drawn up in Missouri, written with such careful calculation, began to look insufficient. Some realized they had packed too much, furniture, heirlooms, books, and were now forced to leave them behind, littering the trail with abandoned possessions. Others realized they had packed too little, their food rations threatening to run out before even the first mountains came into view. Choices had to be made, and none of them were easy. That night, the prairie winds grew restless, rattling wagon covers and carrying with them a sense of unease. Some travelers spoke in hushed tones about those who had come before, stories of graves dotting the trail, of wagons swallowed by rivers, of families lost in sudden storms. Whether true or embellished, the stories sank deep into the minds of the weary, planting seeds of doubt. Could they truly make it to Oregon? Or would they too leave nothing behind but a name carved into a wooden marker along the roadside? And yet, as despair threatened, hope lingered stubbornly. Around each fire there were songs, soft hymns sung by trembling voices, or lullabies meant to quiet frightened children. There were tales told by older men, voices gravelly as they described lands so fertile that wheat grew higher than a man's waist, rivers so full of fish that nets overflowed. These visions, fragile though they were, gave meaning to the struggle. They reminded each traveller that the hardship was not endured in vain. There was something waiting at the end of the trail, something worth every blist, every cough, every mile. As families drifted into uneasy sleep, the prairie night unfolded above them. The stars burned brightly, unclouded by smoke or city lights. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices sharp and lonely. The trail stretched ahead into darkness, unseen but always present, always demanding. And as the last embers of the fires died down, the truth became clearer. Survival would not come through strength alone. It would require faith, persistence, and the willingness to endure pain without surrender. The trail was a merciless teacher, and its lessons had only just begun. The fourth week of travel brought with it a rhythm, one that was less chosen than imposed by necessity. By now, the emigrants had shed much of the early excitement. They no longer spoke in wide-eyed tones about the adventure ahead, nor did they waste much energy imagining the end. The trail itself consumed them. It decided the shape of their days, the weight of their labor, and the small mercies they might find. And like the steady beat of a drum, its cadence was relentless. Each morning began in near silence, save for the muted clatter of pots and the grunts of animals being yoked. Sleep was never deep, often broken by the chill of the prairie or the cries of infants unsettled in the night. The fires from the evening before had long since died into ash, and the prairie grass glistened with dew, which soon turned into dust as the sun climbed higher. Travellers moved with weary precision, rolling bedding, loading supplies, inspecting axles and wheels for cracks. There was no time for idleness. To linger meant to fall behind, and to fall behind was to risk everything. As the wagons creaked forward, they followed trails already worn by thousands before them. Deep ruts carved by iron and wood made steering treacherous, and more than one wheel splintered under the weight. When this happened, progress ground to a halt while men scrambled to cut timber and craft a repair. Some repairs held, others did not, and every delay sent whispers of fear through the company. Each breakdown was a reminder that the trail punished not only the weak, but also the unprepared. The land itself shifted subtly as the caravan moved farther west. The endless plains stretched wide, but the rivers grew more difficult. Fording these waters had already stolen supplies, but now they began to threaten lives. A child slipped from a log and was pulled under by the current before anyone could reach her. Her family screamed her name as the river swallowed her, and by nightfall a small grave marked her passing on the bank. The trail was merciless in this way. Life and death walked side by side, and the company had no choice but to move on, leaving grief behind as quickly as they buried it. Illness became more common with each passing day. The dust, fine and unrelenting, settled in lungs and throats, leading to coughing fits that shook bodies thin with fatigue. Dysentery spread quietly, leaving the weak doubled over in agony. Mothers prayed over children burning with fever, their whispered hymns lost to the prairie winds. There was little to offer by way of treatment, perhaps willow bark tea, perhaps rest, but the trail rarely allowed either. The wagons had to move, and the sick were carried forward, jolting with every rut and rock. Food, once plentiful, began to dwindle. The barrels of flour shrank alarmingly, the salted bacon grew rancid in the heat, and beans, though hardy, became monotonous. Hunters ventured into the tall grasses in search of game, but success was uncertain. Deer and antelope sometimes appeared, graceful and quick, but to kill one required both luck and steady aim. Many nights, supper was little more than hardtack softened in water, filling the stomach but never satisfying hunger. Each bite reminded the emigrants how far they were from the comforts of settled life. Despite the hardships, small moments of beauty lingered. At dusk, the sky stretched wide and endless, painted in colors no canvas could truly capture. The prairie grasses waved in great rippling seas, bending beneath winds that carried scents of earth and wildflowers. Sometimes when the campfires were lit, songs rose into the night, voices fragile but determined. These were not joyous songs, but steady ones, psalms, hymns, and old ballads that bound the weary travellers together. For a moment, under the stars, it felt as though they were less alone. Yet those same stars also mocked them. The enormity of the night sky only deepened their sense of smallness. Families stared upward and felt the crushing weight of distance. Distance from home, distance from safety, distance still to travel. Some wondered if they would ever see Oregon, or if their bones would rest beneath this open sky forever. The trail had a way of stripping away illusions, of forcing people to face truths they would rather avoid. Out here, strength of body was nothing without strength of spirit. Conflicts began to arise within the company. Tempers, once kept in check, now frayed under hunger and exhaustion. Arguments flared over grazing rights for animals, over who should lead, over how much to ration. Some accused others of hoarding supplies, while others whispered about abandoning the slower wagons. Trust, so vital in this shared journey, began to crack. And though apologies often followed, the bitterness remained, a quiet undercurrent threatening to divide them. Through it all, the trail stretched on, silent and indifferent. It cared nothing for grief, hunger or quarrels. It offered no mercy, no shelter, only distance. Each day was measured not in victories, but in survival. To wake, to walk, to eat something, to lie down again, that was triumph enough. And so the emigrants pressed forward, their steps heavy but unbroken, knowing that tomorrow would ask the same and more. For those watching closely, one truth grew clearer with every mile. The Oregon Trail was not simply a road to the west, it was a crucible, burning away comfort, illusion and weakness, leaving only those who could endure the fire of its trials. And though none could yet know what lay ahead, the trail had already begun its work, reshaping each traveller into something harder, something stripped bare, something entirely at the mercy of the land. The fifth stretch of the journey opened with a horizon that seemed endless, a canvas of tall grass rippling like waves under the prairie wind. By now, the emigrants had walked for weeks, and the rhythm of the trail had become both familiar and crushing. Each day blended into the next, the early rousing before dawn, the weary yoking of oxen, the long, slow crawl forward beneath a sun that seemed always intent on burning away their resolve. But this stage of the trail brought with it new challenges, ones not of broken wagons or shallow rivers, but of the mind itself. Fatigue had begun to creep into every corner of their lives. Men stumbled as they walked beside wagons, leaning on rifles as though they were canes. Women stitched with trembling hands, their fingers raw from chores that never ended. Even the children, once buoyed by curiosity, grew quiet. Their laughter faded, replaced by sullen silences as their feet dragged through the dust. The first blush of adventure was gone. Now there was only endurance. The monotony of the plains played cruel tricks on the senses. Days passed with landscapes that seemed never to change. Grass, sky, and the line of wagons ahead, the same sights repeated endlessly. Travellers spoke of mirages shimmering in the distance, visions of lakes or forests that vanished as they drew near. The land was vast, beautiful, and merciless in its sameness. It stripped away the comfort of variety, leaving only the ceaseless question, how far had they truly come, and how much farther could they go? It was during this period that death began to leave its clearer mark. Graves appeared more often now, some freshly dug, others weathered by time. A crude cross here, a pile of stones there, each marking a life lost on the same road they now walked. For the emigrants, these graves were warnings. They whispered of what could happen when luck failed, when sickness struck, when supplies ran out. Sometimes the company paused to bury one of their own, lowering a body into the ground with solemn prayers. But more often they walked past graves that belonged to strangers, pausing only briefly before the trail pulled them onward again. The air itself seemed to carry sickness. Dysentery spread quickly through camps, its misery relentless. Stomachs cramped, bodies weakened, water turned foul inside them. Cholera, though less common, struck with sudden ferocity, taking the strong and the young with equal cruelty. There were no cures to be found, no doctors to lean on, only the desperate hope that illness would pass as suddenly as it came. And when it did not, a shallow grave awaited, the caravan unable to linger long. Food grew scarcer. What had once seemed like a great stockpile, barrels of flour, salted pork, sacks of beans, now dwindled to worrisome levels. Some families began stretching their supplies, thinning flour with wild roots, making broths from bones long since stripped of meat. Hunters roamed farther from the wagons, sometimes returning with hares or prairie birds, sometimes with nothing at all. Hunger gnawed at everyone, not yet starvation, but enough to weaken bodies and sour tempers. And tempers, already stretched thin, often flared into open disputes. The tension within the company deepened. Small arguments over grazing lands for cattle became shouting matches. A wagon delayed by repairs held up the entire train, and bitter words flew. Some families whispered of breaking away, of travelling alone at a faster pace. Others spoke grimly of leaving behind those who slowed them down. The unity that had once bound the emigrants together began to fray, revealing how fragile cooperation could be when survival pressed hard. Yet, amidst the hardship, there were still moments of tenderness. At night, when fires were lit and bellies filled with whatever meagre food remained, families sometimes told stories. Parents recalled tales from the Bible or folk legends from their youth. Children clung to these words, their eyes heavy with sleep, their fears momentarily soothed. Songs rose into the night, quiet hymns carried on the prairie wind. And though each voice trembled with exhaustion, together they formed something stronger than any one could manage alone. One evening, as the company camped near a shallow creek, the sky erupted into colour. The sunset poured itself across the horizon in deep reds and golds, painting the land in a light that made even the most weary pause. For a moment, the suffering seemed distant, replaced by awe at the sheer vastness of creation. It was in these fleeting instants that hope stirred again, fragile yet persistent. Perhaps the land ahead, this fabled Oregon, would offer more than hardship. Perhaps the dream that had lured them here still waited, unchanged, untouched, and worth all that the trail demanded. But when the fires burned low and the stars emerged once more, reality returned with quiet finality. Tomorrow the wagons would creak again. Tomorrow the dust would rise again. Tomorrow the long march would continue, each mile won with sweat and hunger, each day survived through nothing more than sheer will. The Oregon Trail had no sympathy, no mercy, and no end yet in sight. And though the emigrants could not know it, this was still only the beginning of their ordeal. By the sixth stretch of their journey, the emigrants had grown leaner, harder, and quieter. The trail no longer felt like a passage, it felt like a world unto itself, a place where time moved differently, measured not by calendars or clocks, but by the grinding rhythm of wheels, the endless plod of oxen, and the tolling silence of graves. Each morning began the same, and yet each day carried its own test, its own way of wearing down the spirit. The landscape itself shifted as they pressed westward. The endless prairies began to give way to rolling hills, dotted with sparse groves of cottonwoods and willows. Rivers grew wider, deeper, more dangerous. The Platte River in particular sprawled like a great silver serpent across the land, shallow in places, treacherous in others. Crossing it was no simple matter. Wagons had to be caulked and floated like crude boats, oxen urged to swim, families clinging to one another as currents tugged and pulled. More than one wagon train lost not only supplies but lives to the Platte's indifferent flow. It was in these river crossings that fear grew strongest. The groaning timbers of wagons in the water, the shrieks of animals panicked by the current, the screams of children swept from grasping arms, all of it carved deep into memory. Survivors emerged soaked and trembling, staring back at waters that seemed to mock them with every ripple. They knew that rivers still greater lay ahead, each one a new trial waiting to claim its share of the desperate. Illness lingered like an invisible shadow. The dust, stirred by hundreds of hooves and wheels, hung constantly in the air, a choking haze that dried throats and burned eyes. Water, though plentiful in rivers, often carried sickness. Dysentery became a near constant companion, striking suddenly and leaving bodies weak and hollow. At night, the groans of the ill echoed through camps, a reminder that no family was untouched by the trail's invisible hand. Some recovered slowly, their strength returning with time. Others wasted away, carried forward in wagons until they could endure no more. Then came the digging of another grave, a solemn task performed with numb efficiency. Graves had become so common that some travellers ceased to count them. They lined the trail, each marked hastily with wood or stones, names sometimes carved but often left unspoken. Passing emigrants rarely lingered. They could not afford to. Yet for each family who left a loved one behind, the grief was raw and fresh, a wound deepened by the knowledge that the world itself seemed indifferent. The prairie swallowed sorrow as easily as it swallowed sound, leaving only silence in its wake. Supplies dwindled further. Flour turned coarse with grit, bacon spoiled, beans became infested with weevils. Hunters who once found game with ease now returned empty-handed more often than not. The herds of bison that had once roamed in staggering numbers had grown wary of gunfire, moving farther from the trail. Some families resorted to boiling strips of leather, chewing them until softened, pretending it was food. Others thinned soup so far that it became little more than flavoured water, a meal in name only. Hunger gnawed at bones, leaving faces hollow and tempers brittle. Tensions within the wagon company grew sharper. Exhaustion made patience a rare luxury. A family accused their neighbours of stealing flour, only to find it later hidden beneath their own wagon seat. A dispute over the best ford for a river nearly erupted into violence. Men shouted, fists clenched, but the trail itself intervened, demanding energy for survival, not for anger. Slowly, grudgingly, arguments gave way to silence, though the bitterness lingered. The Oregon Trail was not only a test of endurance against nature, but a trial of human nature itself. Yet even in the bleakest days, moments of humanity flickered like dying embers refusing to go out. When a wagon broke, neighbours gathered to lift and mend. When a child fell ill, strangers offered what remedies they had, herbs passed down in memory, or small vials of medicine saved for dire need. When a woman gave birth along the trail, a fragile, terrifying miracle, hands from every family helped, boiling water, fetching cloth, standing guard through the night. In those rare instances, the emigrants remembered why they had chosen to travel together. Alone, they would surely perish. Together, they might endure. At night, under the vast canopy of stars, the emigrants sometimes found themselves caught between despair and awe. The prairie sky was endless, its stars burning brighter than they had ever seen in towns or villages. Some whispered that it was a reminder of God's watchful eye, a comfort in the darkness. Others stared upward and felt only the crushing weight of distance, each star a reminder of how small and fragile they truly were. Around dying campfires, voices sang hymns and prayers, not always with conviction, but with a stubbornness that matched the trail's demands. By now, the emigrants knew that the Oregon Trail was no simple journey of miles. It was a crucible, reshaping them with every hardship. It stripped away illusions of ease, burned away weakness, and demanded sacrifices at every turn. And though no one spoke it aloud, each traveller carried the same gnawing thought. If this was only the beginning, what unimaginable trials still waited in the mountains, deserts, and forests yet unseen? The trail did not answer. It stretched ahead in silence, a road carved by countless footsteps and countless sorrows, waiting patiently for each new soul to offer up what it demanded. And with the rising of another pale dawn, the emigrants rose again, weary but unbroken, and stepped once more into the dust. By the seventh leg of the journey, the emigrants had entered a stretch of land that felt at once breathtaking and cruel. The vast prairie, though beautiful in its endless sweep, had revealed itself as an unforgiving plain, where weather could shift from serenity to savagery in a single afternoon. The skies grew restless and storms became a new adversary, storms that swept across the land with a force that made even the strongest men tremble. The first of these came without warning. Clouds gathered on the horizon, towering higher and darker than any the emigrants had seen. The air grew heavy, still, charged with an energy that prickled against the skin. Then the wind came, sudden and violent, flattening grasses and bending wagon covers until they threatened to tear. Rain followed in sheets, blinding and relentless. Lightning split the sky, its thunder rolling across the plains with a sound like the cracking of the world itself. Wagons pitched and groaned under the force, oxen panicked, children screamed. Families huddled together beneath soaked blankets, praying aloud while the prairie raged around them. When the storm finally passed, it left devastation in its wake. Wagons had toppled, supplies were ruined, and the prairie lay soaked, turning the trail into a sucking mire of mud. Wheels stuck fast, animals strained until veins stood out along their necks, and men pushed with all their strength to move even a single wagon forward. Progress slowed to a crawl, each mile earned through gritted teeth and aching muscles. The storm had shown them plainly. Nature itself was not only an obstacle, but a force that could not be reasoned with, only endured. The nights after such storms carried a peculiar silence. Fires sputtered weakly, fueled by damp wood, casting meagre light against the darkness. Families gathered close, drying what they could, rationing what little had not been spoiled by rain. It was in these fragile evenings that despair crept in most forcefully. Some spoke openly of turning back, though to turn back was as dangerous as pressing on. Others clenched their jaws and said nothing, their silence heavy with doubt. The Oregon Trail was no longer just a journey. It was becoming a question each emigrant had to answer anew each day. Was the dream worth this suffering? Animals, once steady, began to falter. Mud caked their hooves, sores formed beneath yokes, and their bodies grew gaunt from too little rest and too much labor. Each step became a battle for the beasts, their eyes dull, their breaths harsh. Families did what they could, washing wounds, shifting loads, offering scraps of precious food. But many knew that not all would survive. And when an animal collapsed too weak to rise again, there was often no choice but to leave it behind. A wagon without its team was a burden, and burdens could not be afforded. The prairie became littered not only with abandoned belongings, but with the bones of animals sacrificed to the journey. Disease also deepened its grip. Cholera struck without mercy, its symptoms appearing suddenly, vomiting, cramps, and an unquenchable thirst that no amount of water could soothe. Those who succumbed often did so quickly, collapsing by the roadside before their families could even comprehend the loss. The fear of cholera was so great that when a victim died, their bodies were often buried hastily, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without even a name carved in wood. The living could not linger. The trail demanded they move on, even as grief pressed heavy on their hearts. Still, there were moments, brief, fragile, where the emigrants caught glimpses of something beyond suffering. A patch of wildflowers growing defiantly beside the trail. A herd of antelope bounding gracefully across the horizon, their bodies swift and free in ways the emigrants could no longer imagine for themselves. A night sky so brilliant with stars that even the most weary paused to marvel, their eyes lifting in silent wonder. These moments did not erase the hardship, but they gave it context, reminding each traveller of why they endured, the promise of a land that might finally give back more than it took. Stories began to circulate around campfires, not just of Oregon, but of those who had made it before. Families spoke of letters received from distant cousins who described valleys rich with soil, rivers teeming with fish, orchards heavy with fruit. These tales, though sometimes exaggerated, breathed life into weary spirits. The emigrants clung to them like lanterns in the dark, fragile but enough to guide them forward. Without such stories, hope might have flickered out entirely. Yet even as they pressed on, the emigrants knew the trail was testing not just their bodies, but their bonds. Quarrels within families grew sharper, fueled by hunger and exhaustion. A father snapped at his children for lagging behind, his voice raw with frustration. A mother, too tired to soothe, wept quietly over an infant she feared would not survive. Couples argued over rations, over pace, over the very decision that had brought them to this merciless road. And still each morning they rose again, yoked their oxen and took one more step. By this stage, the Oregon Trail had stripped away nearly every comfort and left in its place only necessity. The emigrants carried on not because they felt strong, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was death. With each mile they grew harder, quieter, more resolved. The trail was reshaping them, grinding them down and reforging them into something new. And though none could see beyond the horizon, they knew that greater trials still waited, rivers, deserts, mountains, all lying in silence ahead, daring them to continue. By the 8th stretch of their journey, the emigrants had learned to live in a kind of uneasy rhythm with hardship. It no longer shocked them when a wheel cracked or a wagon sank into the mire. It no longer startled them when someone fell ill or when another grave was dug by the side of the trail. These things had become part of the fabric of their days, woven so tightly into the march westward that to live without them was unthinkable. The Oregon Trail was reshaping them not just in body but in spirit, stripping away the unnecessary, leaving only endurance. Yet even as they adapted, new trials emerged. The heat grew fiercer as summer pressed down upon the plains. By midday, the air shimmered with waves that made the horizon blur and ripple. Wagon covers trapped heat like ovens, and children cried from thirst. Water became precious, guarded more closely than gold. Barrels tied to wagons grew warm beneath the sun, their contents tasting of wood and iron. But still the emigrants drank, knowing that dehydration could claim a life faster than hunger. Families rationed water with trembling hands, measuring out sips as if each drop were a prayer. The search for fresh water dictated much of the company's movements. Scouts rode ahead, scanning for streams or springs. Sometimes they returned with good news, leading the wagons to clear creeks where animals drank deeply and bodies could be washed. Other times they returned empty-handed, their silence more crushing than words. Those days were the hardest, dust-coating tongues, lips cracking, oxen stumbling with foamy sweat dripping from their flanks. Men walked with hollow eyes, women whispered prayers, and children were carried when their legs could no longer bear the weight. The trail grew crowded with reminders of those who had failed. Abandoned wagons leaned at odd angles in the grass, their frames broken, their loads scattered. Rusted pots, torn clothing, and cracked trunks lay strewn across the land like offerings to the wilderness. Each abandoned item told a story, a family forced to lighten its load, to choose between survival and memory. Some emigrants stared long at these relics, wondering who had left them, and whether those people had made it farther than this. Others did not look at all, unwilling to see their own possible future reflected back at them. It was also during this stage that fear of raids began to grow. Whispers spread through the wagon company of attacks, some true, some exaggerated, by native tribes. Stories told of wagons burned, supplies taken, lives lost. In reality, many of these encounters were peaceful, even helpful. Some tribes traded food, water, or directions in exchange for tools or cloth. But fear, once rooted, was hard to shake. Each night, men took turns standing guard, rifles loaded, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. Sleep was lighter than ever, dreams filled with imagined dangers. Yet the greater enemy was not human. It was exhaustion. Step after step, mile after mile, the emigrants found their bodies hollowed by fatigue. Feet blistered and bled, shoulders ached from carrying loads, eyes stung from dust. Even the strongest felt their strength waning, and the weakest often collapsed outright. Still, the caravan moved on, dragging its weary mass westward like some vast, groaning creature. To stop was to die, and so they did not stop. Illness remained a constant companion. A young man collapsed with fever and never rose again. A mother coughed blood into a rag, her face pale, her children silent beside her. A father, too weak to walk, was carried in his own wagon until the day he passed, his family lowering him into the earth with trembling hands. Death did not come as shock now. It came as routine, cruel in its consistency. Graves grew so numerous that some were left unmarked, hidden deliberately so scavengers or wolves would not disturb them. The trail itself was becoming a graveyard stretched thin across the continent. And yet, within the gloom, there were sparks of resilience. A child, despite hunger, laughed at a butterfly that landed on her arm. A group of men, though exhausted, repaired a broken wagon late into the night, their hands blistered but steady. A woman shared her last handful of dried apples with a neighbour's sick child, knowing her own would go hungry. These moments, small as they were, reminded everyone that humanity had not been lost entirely to hardship. The evenings remained a paradox of beauty and sorrow. As the sun dipped low, painting the plains in fire and gold, the wagons would circle and campfires flickered to life. Families huddled close, voices soft, faces lit by flame. Hymns rose again into the night, wavering but steady, carried upward to a sky vast and eternal. For a time, the prairie seemed almost gentle, as if it too paused to listen. But beneath it all was the unspoken knowledge. Tomorrow the march would begin again, and the land would take as much as it gave. The Oregon Trail was not simply a road across the wilderness. It was a crucible in which hope and despair battled daily. Each mile cost something, and the cost was always higher than expected. By now, the emigrants understood this truth fully. Survival meant surrendering comfort, safety, even loved ones. And though they could not yet see the mountains that lay ahead, each step forward carried with it the weight of all they had already lost. By the 9th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had become shadows of their former selves. The bright-eyed optimism that had filled the wagons at Independence was gone, replaced by faces carved with lines of weariness. Clothes hung loose on thinning frames, shoes wore through until feet bled, and hands were calloused and raw. The trail had not only tested them, it had reshaped them. pressing down with a weight so constant that survival itself had become a quiet miracle. The land grew harsher still. The plains, which once seemed endless but familiar, now gave way to more broken ground. The soil grew stonier, the rivers more unpredictable, and the hills began to rise in gentle but foreboding slopes. Every ascent strained the wagons, forcing men and women alike to push alongside the oxen, their muscles burning, their lungs heaving in the dry heat. Each descent threatened disaster, wheels locking, wagons lurching forward with a momentum that could crush anyone caught beneath. It was a cruel rhythm. Climb, strain, descend, fear, over and over again. Water remained a constant concern. Some streams ran foul, their stagnant pools swarming with insects, leaving those who drank from them writhing with sickness. Others seemed clean but carried invisible death, cholera spreading silently with each swallow. Thirst, however, was more immediate than fear. The emigrants drank anyway, knowing that a slow death from disease was easier to ignore than the sharp, immediate agony of a dry mouth and cracked lips. Every drink felt like a gamble, but it was a gamble they could not refuse. Hunger deepened its claws. By now, flour rations had been halved, sometimes quartered, stretched with whatever could be found along the trail, roots dug from the earth, wild berries plucked cautiously, leaves boiled into bitter teas. Meat was rare, and when an animal was killed, every scrap was used. Organs, marrow, even hooves boiled until soft enough to chew. Hunger gnawed not only at bodies but at tempers. Arguments erupted more often, sparked by suspicion of stolen food or the unequal sharing of what little remained. Families who had once sung together at night now turned inward, guarding their supplies with wary eyes. The trail was littered with signs of desperation. Wagons abandoned when oxen could no longer pull them, their contents scattered across the ground. Heavy furniture smashed and left behind, family heirlooms discarded in the grass. A piano once carried with pride by a wealthy family now sat silent and broken on the roadside, its keys bleached by the sun. Each abandoned object was a confession. Comfort had no place here. Only what could sustain life was worth the wait. Illness, too, pressed harder. Dysentery left travellers weak, shivering, unable to rise from the ground. Measles spread quickly through children, leaving fever and rash in its wake. The weakest, infants, the elderly, the frail, succumbed first, their graves multiplying along the trail. Wooden markers leaned in the wind, their names already fading, while stones piled hastily became the only testament to a life. Entire families sometimes dwindled, leaving wagons empty, possessions scattered, and the trail itself heavier with silence. The nights were the cruelest. Exhaustion drove travellers to the ground as soon as camp was made, yet rest rarely came. The howling of wolves in the distance, the groaning of sick companions, the restless shifting of oxen, all conspired to keep sleep shallow. Dreams were haunted not by visions of Oregon, but by fears of the next day. Another river to cross, another storm to endure, another mile of dust. Fires burned low, guarded carefully so as not to waste precious wood, their glow flickering against faces hollow with fatigue. Still, there were sparks of resilience, small but defiant. A child's laugh when fireflies lit up the dusk. A mother's gentle song, soothing her baby though her own voice quivered with exhaustion. A father who gave up his portion of bread so his children could eat. These moments, fragile and fleeting, stitched the emigrants together, reminding them of what they were fighting to preserve. Humanity survived here in fragments, each act of kindness a rebellion against despair. The sky, vast and unyielding, continued to both inspire and crush them. At sunset, the heavens blazed with colours so fierce they seemed painted by fire. The emigrants paused in their labours, staring upward, their struggles momentarily silenced by awe. Yet when night fell, the stars felt merciless, their beauty overwhelming in its reminder of how small the wagons were, how far the land stretched, how uncertain the road remained. By now, each emigrant understood fully. The Oregon Trail was not a simple passage to a promised land. It was a trial of flesh and spirit, a stripping away of illusions, a relentless demand for sacrifice. Every step forward was won at a cost, and though Oregon still lay somewhere beyond the horizon, it was no longer just a dream. It had become a lifeline, the only thing keeping weary bodies moving into the dust and distance, mile after unforgiving mile. By the 10th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had crossed into a place where the trail itself felt alive with menace. The land seemed determined to strip them of every ounce of strength, and each day became a negotiation with exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Their faces, once fresh with hope, had grown gaunt and sunburned, their eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. Hands were blistered from the rains, feet raw from endless walking, and backs bent permanently from the labour of pushing wagons across ruts so deep they could swallow a wheel whole. The air had grown drier, harsher. Grass no longer waved in green seas, but thinned into patches, brittle and brown beneath a merciless sun. Finding food for the animals became nearly impossible. Oxen stumbled, ribs jutting out from their sides, tongues lolling as they strained under loads too heavy for their fading strength. When one fell and could not rise, there was rarely time for sentiment. Knives came out quickly, flesh was carved, salted if possible, eaten if not. To waste even the body of a faithful beast was unthinkable now. Survival did not permit grief to linger. It was during this stage that the emigrants discovered the haunting silence of the prairie. With fewer trees, fewer rivers, fewer signs of life, the land stretched wide and empty, oppressive in its vastness. The wind swept across it with a sound like whispering voices, eerie in its constancy. Some travellers spoke of hearing things at night, phantom cries, imagined footsteps, the groaning of wagons that were not there. Whether born of fear or fatigue, these hallucinations spread quietly, leaving many uneasy as they tried to sleep under the weight of endless stars. Food supplies had grown desperately low. Families who once measured their rations carefully now found themselves scraping the bottoms of barrels, baking bread so thin it barely held together, boiling what little remained into watery gruel. Children whimpered at night, their stomachs hollow, their bodies weakened. Parents gave up their shares so the youngest might endure, though such sacrifices left them too frail to carry on. Each meal became both blessing and torment, prolonging life but never satisfying hunger. Illness thrived in this weakened state. Dysentery, measles, and cholera continued to steal lives, but now scurvy made its presence known. Gums bled, teeth loosened, muscles cramped from the lack of fresh food. The trail, already merciless, offered no remedy. Berries were rare, vegetables non-existent. Only the faint hope of reaching trading posts kept spirits from collapsing entirely. But even those posts, when reached, were often bare, supplies long since picked clean by earlier wagon trains. Families traded precious heirlooms for scraps, a silver watch for a sack of flour, a wedding ring for a handful of dried beans. Death, always near, became a daily companion. Graves dotted the landscape more heavily now, the earth freshly turned in too many places. Some families carved names into wooden crosses, while others could not even spare that much time or wood, leaving their dead beneath simple piles of stone. In the rush to move on, some graves were shallow, quickly covered, the dirt barely concealing the outline beneath. The trail was not only a road but a cemetery, stretching further each day. Travellers stepped past graves, knowing one might soon be their own. The strain of survival had begun to erode bonds within the wagon company. Trust grew scarce, kindness scarcer. Families who once shared supplies now kept to themselves, guarding their dwindling stores with wary eyes. A few wagons split off entirely, choosing to take their chances alone rather than endure the constant disputes. Those who remained travelled together in silence, unity held not by affection but by necessity. The Oregon Trail revealed, more clearly than ever, how fragile cooperation could be when pressed against the wall of hunger and fear. Yet, amidst the suffering, moments of stubborn beauty persisted. At dawn, when the prairie lay still, the rising sun cast the land in soft hues of pink and gold. The air, cool before the heat of the day, felt almost merciful, a fleeting reminder that the world was not always cruel. Children, even weak, found joy in simple discoveries, an insect crawling across a stone, a bird wheeling high above. These small wonders carried weight far beyond their size, reminders that not everything had been lost to hardship. At night, when the campfires burned low, the emigrants clung to stories. Tales of Oregon grew more vivid, almost fantastical in their detail. Men spoke of valleys so green they seemed untouched by hardship, of rivers teeming with salmon, of orchards heavy with apples. Women spoke of homes yet to be built, of gardens to be planted, of children who might grow without the shadow of hunger. These stories were fragile, perhaps exaggerated, but they were necessary. Without them, the emigrants knew the trail would swallow them whole. By this point, the Oregon Trail had stripped away nearly everything except endurance itself. The emigrants pressed on not because of strength nor even hope, but because there was no other choice. To stop was to die, and so they moved forward, step after weary step, their eyes fixed on horizons that never seemed closer. They did not yet know what lay ahead. Mountains, deserts, rivers still fiercer than those already crossed. But they knew one thing with certainty. The trail had no mercy to give, and they would need to summon every fragment of will to see it through. By the 11th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had reached the place where the plains began to surrender to harsher terrain. The wide open fields that once stretched like an ocean of grass now fractured into drier lands, dotted with scrub and broken stone. The trail, already a merciless teacher, introduced a new lesson: scarcity. Not just of food, but of water, of shelter, of even the energy to carry on. The sun grew crueler here, burning overhead without mercy. Midday became an ordeal of heat shimmering off the ground, each step sinking into dust that clung to skin and lungs alike. The wagons rolled more slowly, animals stumbling with each mile, their tongues swollen and cracked. The emigrants themselves fared little better, lips split, skin blistered, eyes squinted against the brightness. Even the smallest chores, tying a rope, lifting a bucket, felt monumental under the weight of fatigue and the pressing heat. Water, once difficult to find, now became a matter of survival. Scouts rode ahead for hours, sometimes returning with news of a stream, sometimes shaking their heads with grim silence. When water was found, it was often muddy, stagnant, alive with insects. Still, families rushed to it, cupping their hands, filling barrels, letting the animals plunge their snouts deep. And yet too often, the water brought sickness, spreading cramps and fever through camp. The emigrants drank anyway. Choice had long since been stripped away. Food was nearly gone. The last scraps of bacon clung to the bottom of barrels, the flour darkened with age and insects. Some baked bread so hard it cracked teeth, others boiled whatever they could scavenge. Roots, weeds, even the bones of animals boiled a second and third time to leach out the last traces of nourishment. Starvation crept closer with each passing day, weakening limbs, hollowing faces, breaking spirits. Families looked to their herds with desperate calculation, knowing that to slaughter a weakened ox meant losing the strength to pull the wagon, but to keep it alive meant risking their own hunger. The trail itself grew more treacherous. Ruts deepened into jagged scars carved into the earth by countless wheels before. Wagons lurched dangerously, their loads swaying, threatening to topple at every slope. Axles snapped more often now, the wood dry and brittle from the heat. Repairs drained energy and supplies. Iron nails bent, wood splintered, ropes frayed. Every crack of timber carried with it the same dreadful thought. If the wagon failed completely, all would be lost. Death, so common before, became even more frequent now. Sometimes it came slowly, after days of illness and wasting away. Other times it came suddenly, an ox collapsing, a wagon overturning, a child swallowed by river currents too swift to resist. Graves were dug in haste, their markers fewer and cruder as time and wood grew scarce. Some were left unmarked entirely, the earth smoothed over to hide the presence of the dead, protecting the bodies from wolves or scavengers. The trail was becoming not just a road, but a map of sorrow, lined with memories that would never be spoken again. The emigrants' faith was tested daily. At night, beneath skies brilliant with stars, some still knelt to pray, whispering psalms into the darkness. Others turned their eyes upward in silence, no longer sure if prayers were heard or if they mattered. The Oregon Trail did not bend to faith. It swallowed the devout and the doubtful alike. And yet, faith lingered like the faint glow of embers, fragile but persistent, keeping despair from consuming entirely. Conflicts among families deepened. Hunger made tempers sharp, thirst made words cruel. Disputes over whose animals drank first, whose children ate more, whose wagons slowed the train. These arguments sparked often, sometimes ending in fists, sometimes in sullen silence. Bonds that once seemed unbreakable cracked beneath the strain. Yet at the same time, the emigrants discovered that cooperation was the only thing that kept them alive. When a wagon broke, even the most bitter rivals lent a hand, if only because their own survival depended on it. There were still moments, small, fleeting, when beauty broke through. At dawn, the light spread across the prairie with a gentleness that belied the cruelty of the day to come. In the evenings, the sky turned crimson and gold, painting the land in hues so vivid it made even the most weary pause in wonder. Children, though thin and pale, still found joy in fireflies at dusk or in chasing one another around the wagons. Mothers sang softly, their voices trembling but steady enough to lull infants into fragile sleep. These moments were the thread holding the emigrants together, binding them to the promise that somewhere beyond the horizon, all this suffering might be redeemed. By now, the Oregon Trail had stripped away nearly every illusion of what this journey might have been. It was not adventure, not romance, not discovery. It was survival, and survival alone. The emigrants carried on, step by agonizing step, because there was no turning back. Behind them lay only graves and emptiness. Ahead lay Oregon, distant, unseen, but burning in their minds as the last light of hope. And so, with bodies broken and spirits bruised, they pressed forward into the silence of another endless day. By the 12th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had come face to face with the slow cruelty of distance. They had walked for months, yet Oregon still lay impossibly far ahead, like a promise always shimmering on the horizon, but never within reach. Each mile blurred into the next, an endless grind of dust, sweat, and silence. To endure the trail now required not only strength, but a kind of numbness, the ability to push forward without thinking too long on how much remained. The land itself grew starker, its beauty edged with menace. The grasses thinned, the soil hardened, and the sky seemed larger than ever, a vast dome under which the emigrants appeared no more significant than ants crawling across the earth. Winds scoured the plains, carrying dust that filled eyes and lungs until coughing became as constant as breathing. The trail offered no shade, no reprieve, only a relentless press forward. Even the animals grew restless, their ribs stark against their hides, their groans echoing into the dry air. Water was still the measure of hope. Scouts searched ceaselessly, scanning every rise and dip in the land for signs of springs or rivers. When a source was found, there was celebration. Barrels filled, faces washed, oxen allowed to drink until their bodies stopped quivering. But more often the water was brackish or fouled, leaving behind sickness that stole what little strength remained. The emigrants learned quickly that survival meant risk, that every sip could heal or harm, and that thirst itself would kill faster than disease. Hunger hollowed them further. Rations had become so meager that meals no longer satisfied, only delayed collapse. Hardtack softened in water, broth so thin it was little more than a memory of food. Families dug for roots, gathered wild greens, even roasted insects over small fires, anything to fill the emptiness gnawing at their bellies. When an animal collapsed, its meat was stripped quickly, divided among the wagons with a grim efficiency. There was no waste, no luxury, only the practical calculation of survival. Illness was everywhere, a constant shadow trailing the company. Cholera struck swiftly, taking some in hours, leaving bodies limp and pale before nightfall. Dysentery continued to wear down the weak, its misery sapping strength day after day. Fever haunted the nights, children burning in their mothers' arms while prayers rose faintly into the darkness. Entire families sometimes faltered, reduced to silence as their loved ones wasted away beside them. And yet, the caravan did not stop for long. To linger too long in one place was to risk the same fate. The trail demanded movement, and the dead were buried in haste. The graves grew so numerous now that the emigrants often passed them without comment. A line of stones, a tilted cross, a patch of earth still raw, each a marker of someone who had failed to endure. Sometimes wagons rolled past with heads bowed in silence. Other times no one looked at all, as if turning away could shield them from the truth that death walked among them too. The trail itself had become lined with ghosts, silent witnesses to the suffering of those who followed. Fatigue stripped away civility. Arguments that once ended in apologies now ended in silence, or worse, in division. A few families broke from the company altogether, choosing to risk the wilderness alone rather than endure the friction of so many weary souls packed together. Those who remained did so because they understood, however bitterly, that their survival depended on unity. A broken wagon could not be lifted by one pair of hands. A sick child could not be watched by one pair of eyes. Cooperation was fragile, but it was the only shield they had. And still, in the midst of despair, life asserted itself. A child was born along the trail, delivered in a wagon lined with blankets. Her cries pierced the night, a sound both terrifying and beautiful, proof that hope could be reborn even in the harshest of places. Men and women gathered around, exhausted but smiling faintly, offering prayers for her survival. In that moment, the company remembered that they were not only fleeing hunger and hardship, they were building something, carrying life itself into the unknown. The nights grew colder now, the heat of the day giving way to winds that cut through blankets and clothes. Fires burned small, their light flickering against faces etched with lines of weariness. Songs rose again, though softer than before, voices trembling with fatigue. Hymns carried on the wind, sometimes no more than whispers, yet still they bound the emigrants together. For even the most broken among them found a strange comfort in song, as though it reminded them that they were still human, still part of something larger than suffering. By this point, the Oregon Trail was less a journey and more a crucible. It burned away illusions, comfort, even hope, leaving only the raw will to survive. The emigrants pressed forward, not because they believed the worst was behind them, but because stopping meant surrendering to death. Each step was heavy, each mile a victory. And though they could not yet see the mountains rising in the distance, they felt them looming, waiting, a final trial that would demand more than they had ever given. Still, they moved on, driven by the faint, stubborn promise that beyond all this suffering, a better life might yet be waiting. By the 13th stretch of the journey, the first outlines of mountains began to shimmer on the horizon. They were faint at first, like ghosts rising from the haze, but their presence stirred both awe and dread among the emigrants. For weeks they had walked across the monotony of plains, and now the land itself rose up before them, immense and immovable. The sight gave some hope. Oregon must lie beyond those peaks. But for others, the looming ridges only deepened their despair. If the trail had already broken them on flat ground, what chance did they have against mountains? The approach to the Rockies was not sudden. The plains gave way slowly, rising in uneven swells, their grasses replaced by hard soil and sparse shrubs. Rivers became swifter, cutting deeper channels into the land. Crossing them was more dangerous than ever. Wagons tipped on steep banks, oxen lost their footing in currents, children were swept downstream before frantic arms could grasp them. Families lashed wagons together, praying that combined strength would hold against the pull of water. But too often the rivers claimed what they wanted: supplies, animals, and sometimes lives. The terrain grew rockier with each mile. Wheels splintered against hidden stones, axles groaned and snapped. Repairs consumed hours of labor, draining the last reserves of strength. Some wagons, too battered to mend, were abandoned entirely. Families faced impossible choices: what to carry, what to leave behind. Heavy furniture, once symbols of pride, was cast aside. Pianos, wardrobes, clocks, all left to rot in the wilderness. Even books and heirlooms were sacrificed, their weight too costly to bear. In their place, families carried only what could sustain them: tools, blankets, food, and hope. Food itself had dwindled to near nothing. Flour stretched thin, biscuits broken into crumbs. Hunters scoured the ridges for game, but deer and elk grew scarce, wary of the constant human presence. Rabbits and birds provided occasional meals, but never enough. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, weakening bodies already bent by fatigue. Some spoke in whispers of resorting to measures unthinkable, eating their draft animals, perhaps even worse, but the words died quickly, swallowed by silence and fear. Illness continued to stalk the company. The close press of weary bodies, the constant exposure to dust, cold, and foul water left everyone vulnerable. Dysentery drained the weak. Cholera struck suddenly, leaving families bereft within hours. Pneumonia crept in as nights grew colder, filling lungs with fire and drowning breaths in ragged gasps. Graves multiplied along the trail, marked hurriedly with stones, crosses, or nothing at all. Sometimes they passed through valleys where the earth itself seemed scarred with graves, as though the land had been claimed not by settlers but by death. Fatigue eroded not only flesh but spirit. Men who had once walked tall now trudged with eyes fixed on the ground. Women who had once soothed children with songs now spoke in harsh whispers, their patience worn to threads. Children, once lively with curiosity, grew silent and gaunt. The trail had a way of leeching the vitality from even the strongest souls, leaving only shadows who walked because there was no other choice. And yet, the emigrants discovered that desperation could forge resilience. When a wagon splintered, strangers lifted alongside family. When food ran low, some shared what little they had, even at risk of their own hunger. Around campfires, voices still rose in prayer, though sometimes cracked with doubt. Songs, faint and trembling, echoed across the wilderness. These fragile acts of humanity became as vital as food or water, reminders that they were not merely survivors, but people bound together by something larger than fear. The nights near the mountains carried a different kind of weight. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying scents of pine and stone. Fires crackled louder in the thin air, their smoke rising like signals into a sky heavy with stars. Wolves howled more often now, their voices eerie in the distance, reminders that predators moved in the shadows. Men kept watch with rifles across their knees, though many knew they could not fend off every threat. The wilderness was vast, and they were so very small within it. Still, the mountains stood, silent and immense, growing clearer with each day. Their snow-capped peaks glowed at dusk, catching the last light of the sun in shades of gold and fire. Some emigrants stared at them with awe, whispering prayers of gratitude that the long plains were nearly behind them. Others looked with dread, calculating what little strength remained and wondering if it would be enough. The Oregon Trail had taken so much already. To climb mountains now felt like facing a final judgment, a question of who would endure and who would not. By this point, the emigrants knew with certainty survival was no longer a matter of luck, nor even of faith alone. It was a matter of endurance, of pushing forward through exhaustion so deep it threatened to crush the spirit entirely. The mountains loomed like a test carved into stone, indifferent to hope, demanding only sacrifice. And though the emigrants trembled at the sight, they pressed onward still, each step carrying them closer to a trial that would decide whether they lived to see the land they sought, or whether their names would join the countless others lost to the silence of the trail. By the 14th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had reached the foothills of the mountains. The land beneath their feet no longer rolled gently but lifted sharply, rising in jagged ridges and narrow passes. The wagons, once pulled with steady rhythm across the plains, now lurched and groaned under the strain of every incline. Oxen strained against their yokes, their bodies trembling, hooves slipping on stone. Each ascent seemed endless, each descent even more treacherous, threatening to pitch wagons forward into disaster. The trail, always merciless, had grown more perilous still. The mountains loomed not only as obstacles of stone, but as symbols of final judgment. Their peaks cut into the sky like blades, snow glinting even in the heart of summer. For the emigrants, they represented both hope and terror. Hope that Oregon lay beyond, terror that they might never find the strength to cross. Some stared at the mountains with awe, whispering prayers of determination. Others fell silent, unwilling to voice the dread that pressed down as heavily as the slopes themselves. Each mile consumed strength at a frightening pace. Wagons had to be unloaded and carried piece by piece up steep inclines, then reassembled before moving on. Families worked side by side, their hands blistered, their backs bent until they could barely stand. Men pulled ropes tied to wagon tongues, leaning forward with all their weight, while women pushed from behind, skirts dragging in dust and mud. Children carried smaller loads, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes no more than a mile or two in an entire day. The nights grew colder as the company climbed higher. Fires, once enough to warm, now sputtered weakly against the chill of mountain winds. Blankets provided little comfort, and families huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close to stave off the bitter cold. Sleep was shallow, broken by coughing fits, the cries of infants and the groaning of animals. Frost appeared on wagon covers, glistening faintly in moonlight, a quiet reminder of how thin the line between survival and death had become. Food, already scarce, dwindled to near nothing. Hunters found little in the mountains beyond small game, hares, squirrels, the occasional bird. Elk and deer, when spotted, were swift and elusive, disappearing into forests before shots could find them. Families boiled bones again and again, scraping the last scraps of fat from skins. Flour was mixed with bark or wild roots stretched into bitter bread. Hunger became a dull, constant ache, an emptiness that could not be ignored. Children cried through the night, their thin voices rising like ghostly echoes against the ridges. Illness thrived in the cold, damp air. Pneumonia spread quickly, filling lungs with fluid, leaving victims gasping for breath. Fevers raged through camp, shaking bodies already weak from hunger. Dysentery lingered still, striking without mercy. Graves were dug into rocky soil, shallow and difficult, stones piled high to keep scavengers at bay. Some families had buried so many by now that they dug in silence, their grief muted by numb exhaustion. Death had become less a shock than a rhythm of the trail, as familiar as the creak of wheels or the call of oxen. Quarrels erupted more often. The mountains tested patience as much as strength. Families argued over which pass to take, how to ration food, when to rest. Some accused others of laziness, of slowing the train. Others whispered of betrayal, of supplies hidden or hoarded. Tempers flared in the thin air, voices sharp, fists clenched. Yet even in conflict, the emigrants were bound together by necessity. To travel alone in these mountains was to court certain death, and so, reluctantly, bitterly, they endured one another. Still, there were moments when the mountains revealed a kind of terrible beauty. At dawn, peaks glowed with light, their snowfields touched with fire as the sun rose. Valleys opened below, vast and silent, filled with forests and rivers that shimmered like silver threads. The air, though cold, carried the scent of pine, sharp and clean, a reminder that the world was not only harsh but magnificent. In these moments, even the most weary paused, their faces lifted toward the sky, their hearts stirred faintly by something beyond survival. Songs returned in the evenings, softer now, voices hoarse but steady. Hymns echoed against the stone, carried by winds through narrow passes. Some prayed with renewed fervor, seeing in the grandeur of the mountains a sign of divine presence. Others sang not from faith but from desperation, clinging to the act itself as a way to keep despair at bay. In song, the emigrants found a fragile unity, a reminder that they were still more than shadows trudging through wilderness. By this stage, the Oregon Trail had transformed from a test of endurance into a crucible of will. The plains had stripped them of comfort. The mountains now demanded everything else. Each step forward was agony, each mile a victory. And yet, still they climbed, pulled by the faint promise that beyond the ridges, beyond the cold, beyond the graves, there lay a land worth all this suffering. A land fertile, green, and waiting. The emigrants carried that vision like a flame in their hearts, flickering but unextinguished, guiding them deeper into the shadow of the mountains. By the 15th stretch of the journey, the emigrants were swallowed fully by the mountains. The trail twisted sharply now, climbing and falling in dizzying switchbacks, forcing wagons along paths barely wide enough for their wheels. Each turn revealed another slope, another wall of stone, another reminder that this was no ordinary land, but a labyrinth of rock and forest that demanded every ounce of human will. The plains had broken bodies. The mountains now tested souls. Progress slowed to a crawl. Wagons had to be dismantled on narrow ledges, their loads carried piece by piece across treacherous ground. Men strained under sacks of flour, women bent low with bundles of clothing, children dragged ropes tied to tools and utensils. Then, once the wagons were rebuilt, they creaked forward again, their wheels groaning, their frames shuddering against the stones. Each day's journey was measured not in miles, but in hours of labor. Each night's rest haunted by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same. The animals suffered most of all. Oxen slipped on loose gravel, their hooves scraping stone, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Some tumbled into ravines, their cries echoing off the cliffs before silence claimed them. When this happened, wagons were left stranded, families forced to abandon them or beg others to share space for what little could be saved. Mules, though stubborn, proved hardier, climbing where oxen faltered, but even they grew thin, ribs showing beneath worn hides. The loss of every animal was a blow not only of labor, but of hope. Food supplies were nearly gone. Flour stretched so thin that bread was no more than a paste baked into hard cakes. Beans, once plentiful, were boiled until they disintegrated into bitter mush. Salt pork had long since spoiled, its rancid smell enough to make the weak wretch. Hunters scoured the forests, sometimes returning with squirrels, rabbits, or the occasional bird. On rare nights, meat simmered in iron pots, its scent filling the camp with a bittersweet reminder of better days. Yet such meals were too rare to stave off hunger. Bellies remained hollow, faces gaunt, eyes sunken with fatigue. Illness followed closely. The damp chill of the mountains seeped into bones, leaving many coughing, their lungs rattling with phlegm. Pneumonia claimed lives quickly. The sick, too weak to rise, their breath fading in the dark hours before dawn. Fevers burned, leaving children delirious in their mothers' arms. Dysentery lingered still, cruel in its persistence. Each grave dug into rocky soil was harder than the last, the ground unyielding beneath pick and shovel. Stones were piled over the dead to keep scavengers away, though everyone knew that nothing could keep sorrow from creeping through the company. Quarrels became more bitter in the thin mountain air. Families argued over space in wagons, over whose animals would pull, over who had given or withheld aid. Trust, already fragile, cracked further. Some accused others of cowardice, of slowing the company, of wasting precious time. Others whispered of abandoning the weak entirely, of moving faster with fewer mouths to feed. Desperation sharpened every word, every suspicion. Yet still they travelled together. For even hatred could not outmatch necessity. Alone, no family could survive. But within the hardship, moments of strange beauty persisted. The mountains themselves, though cruel, were magnificent. Valleys opened beneath them, vast and green, threaded with silver rivers. Peaks loomed above, their crowns of snow glowing in sunlight, their shadows stretching long across the land. Pines rose tall and dark, their scent sharp in the thin air. At night, when fires flickered weakly, stars blazed so fiercely against the black sky that it seemed the heavens had opened. For a moment, the emigrants forgot their hunger, their pain, their grief, and felt instead the weight of wonder. Stories returned in these hours. Parents told children of Oregon, of valleys fertile and wide, of orchards heavy with fruit, of rivers brimming with fish. These stories had grown over the miles, embroidered with hope, but they were necessary. They were not lies, but lifelines, threads binding weary minds to the belief that this suffering was not without purpose. Without them, the emigrants knew, despair would consume them entirely. By now, every step forward felt like defiance. The trail demanded sacrifice, yet still they pressed on. They no longer asked whether they could endure, for to ask was to falter. Instead, they moved forward as though in a trance, driven by something deeper than strength, an instinct, a stubborn refusal to surrender. The mountains loomed higher, the paths grew narrower, the air thinner, yet still the wagons creaked onward. Each mile was won, not with ease, but with blood, sweat, and tears. The Oregon Trail had already taken so much: food, health, animals, loved ones. And yet, in the hearts of those who still walked, a faint ember of hope burned. They clung to it fiercely, for it was the only warmth left to them. Beyond the ridges, beyond the endless stone and snow, they believed there was a place where the suffering might end. And though they could not yet see it, they carried it within them, step after weary step, into the heart of the mountains. By the 16th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had crossed deeper into the mountains, where the trail narrowed into paths carved precariously along cliffsides. Here, the Oregon Trail seemed less a road and more a thread woven into the bones of the earth, clinging to the rock as though it too might fall away at any moment. Wagons groaned dangerously on ledges so narrow that one slip could send them tumbling into ravines. Families moved in silence through these places, their faces pale, their hands gripping ropes, every sound of cracking timber a whisper of death. The labour was ceaseless. Each incline demanded ropes, pulleys, and the combined strength of men, women, and even children. Wagons were dragged upward inch by inch, the oxen straining until their bodies shook, veins bulging in their necks. At the steepest climbs, loads had to be carried separately. Barrels of flour, bundles of clothing, iron tools, all lifted on shoulders, hauled painfully up the slope and then reloaded again. Hours passed for every mile gained. Nights fell with only a few ridges conquered, and still the emigrants pressed on, for the trail offered no mercy to those who lingered. The cold grew sharper, cutting through layers of cloth until skin felt raw beneath it. Frost rimed the edges of wagons, clinging to canvas covers, creeping into seams. Fires were harder to start in the thin air, wood scarce and damp, but without them, the chill was unbearable. Families huddled together in shivering knots, their bodies pressed close, breath clouding in the dark. Blankets, thin and worn, offered little comfort. Infants whimpered, their cries weak, their bodies fragile against the bite of cold. Parents held them tighter, whispering lullabies even as doubt clawed silently at their own hearts. Food was now little more than memory. The last scraps of flour had been rationed into paste, stretched beyond reason. Beans, once the staple, were long gone. Dried fruit and meat had vanished weeks before. Now the emigrants survived on what the land might yield. Roots boiled into bitter stews, bark ground and baked into coarse cakes, squirrels or birds caught in snares. Some slaughtered their oxen, the very beasts that pulled their wagons, trading progress for one last meal. Every decision was a gamble. To eat meant survival today, but perhaps ruin tomorrow when the wagons could no longer move. Illness thrived in these conditions. Pneumonia grew rampant, its rasping coughs echoing through camp at night. Fever burned unchecked, delirium setting in as bodies weakened from hunger. Dysentery lingered still, cruel and unrelenting. The rocky soil made graves harder to dig, forcing families to heap stones over their dead, each cairn a silent marker of loss. Some wept openly, their grief raw. Others dug in silence, their faces numb, their tears long since spent. The trail demanded not only lives, but the surrender of mourning itself, for sorrow could not halt the march forward. The emigrants grew harder, quieter. Conversations became fewer, laughter nearly vanished. Voices rose only when necessary, commands to oxen, warnings of danger, whispered prayers. Children who once sang on the plains now walked in silence, their eyes wide, their bodies frail. Mothers carried them when they could, but more often the children trudged with the others, their small footsteps echoing the weariness of the company. And yet, even in the harshest hours, the mountains revealed moments of fragile wonder. At dusk, peaks glowed with a brilliance that stole breath away, their snowfields painted with fire by the setting sun. Valleys opened below, vast and still, filled with forests and streams glittering like threads of glass. At night, the heavens stretched endless above, stars blazing so fiercely that the sky seemed alive. In those moments, the emigrants remembered why they walked, because somewhere beyond all this, beyond the stone and the snow, there was land waiting. Land where rivers ran clean, where soil was rich, where hunger might finally be banished. Stories kept that vision alive. Around meagre fires, parents spoke softly of homes yet to be built, of orchards and gardens, of fields ripe with wheat. Children listened with tired eyes, their imaginations clinging to those promises. The stories grew more vivid the longer they travelled, embroidered with hope until they became visions of paradise. Whether true or not, they were lifelines. They gave weight to weary footsteps, breath to tired lungs, courage to battered hearts. But the trail was not through with them yet. The mountains pressed higher, the air thinner, the path narrower still. The emigrants could feel it in their bones, that they had entered a place that would claim many before it allowed any to pass. Still, with each sunrise they rose again, yoked the oxen and stepped forward into the cold. Not because they were strong, not because they were fearless, but because to stop now was to surrender everything. The Oregon Trail allowed no rest, no retreat. It demanded movement, and so they moved, carrying their fading strength toward whatever lay beyond the peaks. By the 17th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had reached the high passes of the mountains, where the air thinned and every breath felt like a labor. The trail narrowed into jagged corridors of stone, and snow lingered stubbornly even in summer, its cold seeping into their bones. Here, progress was measured not in miles, but in steps, each one take against the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and the looming spectre of death. The wagons groaned louder with every ascent. Their wheels slipped on loose gravel, their frames creaked beneath the strain. Families lashed ropes to their sides, men and women alike pulling together while oxen strained ahead. Children pushed from behind, their small hands blistered, their bodies trembling with effort. Sometimes the wagons toppled anyway, sliding against rocks, spilling supplies into ravines. The crash of wood splintering echoed like a final verdict, a reminder that the mountains showed no mercy. When this happened, families salvaged what they could, but often much was lost: flour, tools, blankets, all scattered and gone forever. The cold sharpened as nights grew longer. Fires built with wood scavenged from sparse pines sputtered against the wind. Families huddled close, blankets wrapped tightly, their breath rising in clouds. Infants whimpered in the dark, their cries weak, their mothers whispering songs to soothe them. The old and frail suffered most. Their bodies, already worn thin by weeks of hunger, gave way quickly in the thin mountain air. Graves dug shallow into frozen soil grew more frequent. Stones were piled high to guard the dead, though nothing could guard the living from the sight of yet another loss. Food was almost gone. What little flour remained was baked into thin cakes, bitter and hard. Hunters found little among the rocks and snow, only the occasional bird or rabbit too small to satisfy. Some families slaughtered their oxen, roasting the meat while knowing the loss of their beasts would slow them fatally. Hunger hollowed faces into skulls, eyes wide and sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. Children clung to scraps as though they were treasures, chewing slowly, unwilling to swallow for fear the taste would vanish too soon. Illness spread more fiercely now. The cold brought coughs that turned into pneumonia, leaving men gasping as if the mountains themselves were squeezing the air from their lungs. Fevers raged, burning through the nights, leaving children delirious in their mothers' arms. Dysentery and cholera had not vanished. They lingered, cruel companions that struck the weak and left them too frail to rise. Every morning someone did not wake. The trail claimed them quietly, without fanfare, and the company moved on, the graves behind them blending into countless others. Tension pressed heavy within the wagon train. Families argued over which path to take, which pass seemed safest. Some urged speed, fearing the snow would fall early and trap them. Others urged caution, warning that haste would only bring more deaths. Voices rose, bitter and sharp, fueled by hunger and fear. A few wagons split away entirely, vanishing into the mountains to seek their own path. Those who remained knew such separations rarely ended well, but no one had the strength to stop them. And yet, amidst all this hardship, there were moments of strange, quiet majesty. At sunrise, peaks glowed pink and gold, their crowns of snow glistening in the first light. Valleys stretched far below, filled with rivers that shimmered like threads of silver. In the thin air, the world felt vast and eternal, dwarfing the suffering of those who crawled across its slopes. Some emigrants stared in silence, their grief and exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by awe. Others whispered prayers, believing the beauty itself was a sign that God still watched over them. Songs continued, though faintly. Around fires that barely flickered, voices rose in hymns, trembling but steady enough to carry through the night air. Children fell asleep to the sound, their faces pressed against their mothers' arms. Even the weary found comfort in the act of singing, for it was proof that they were still human, still bound together by something beyond mere survival. The mountains had taken much, but they had not silenced hope entirely. Each morning, as the sun rose over the peaks, the emigrants rose with it. Their movements were slow, their faces pale, but still they gathered their strength, yoked their oxen, and pressed forward. They no longer spoke of Oregon with certainty. It felt too far, too impossible, but the thought of it lingered like a distant fire, faint but visible. It was enough to keep them moving, enough to push one foot in front of the other. By this point, the Oregon Trail had stripped them of nearly everything, possessions, health, even loved ones. And still they walked. Not because they believed they were strong, but because the alternative was to stop. And in the mountains, stopping was death. So they pressed forward into the thin air, into the biting cold, into the endless stone, clinging desperately to the fragile ember of hope that still flickered within them. By the 18th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had passed the highest ridges and now began their slow descent into valleys where the land seemed both kinder and crueler at once. The worst of the mountains might have been behind them, but the trail had not loosened its grip. Instead, it revealed a new face, a land marked by deserts and stretches of arid soil where thirst became the fiercest enemy of all. The descent itself was perilous. Wagons creaked and groaned as they were lowered down steep slopes, ropes tied around trunks of pine to slow their weight. Men braced themselves against the wood, their muscles straining as the wheels skidded and sparked on stone. Oxen stumbled forward cautiously, their hooves slipping in gravel, their bodies trembling with fatigue. Families held their breath at every turn, fearing a wagon might break free, plunge downward and shatter both wood and lives in a heartbeat. More than once that fear became reality, the sound of timber splintering echoing through the valleys as yet another wagon was lost to gravity. When at last the slopes eased, the emigrants expected relief. Instead, they found the land stretched barren before them. Rivers grew fewer, their banks dry and cracked. Grass was scarce, leaving animals without forage. The ground turned dusty, brittle beneath their feet, the sun glaring down with relentless fire. By midday, heat shimmered across the earth, and the wagons seemed to crawl through a furnace. Water barrels ran low, lips cracked and bled, tongues swelled from thirst. Every sip was measured, every drop guarded like treasure. The children suffered most. Their thin bodies could not bear the lack of water, and they cried weakly, their voices rasping in the heat. Mothers tried to soothe them, dipping cloths in what little water remained to press against their lips, but it was never enough. Men searched desperately for streams, digging into dry creek beds, sometimes striking damp sand that offered a trickle, sometimes nothing at all. Despair deepened with each fruitless effort, the silence of the land mocking their thirst. Food was no better. Supplies had long since dwindled, leaving only scraps. Flour was stretched so far it became dust mixed with water, baked into bitter paste. Game was scarce in the arid valleys, the animals as thirsty as the emigrants themselves. Occasionally a rabbit or bird provided a meagre meal, but hunger remained constant, gnawing at bellies that had forgotten what it meant to feel full. Families grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their steps slow. Even the oxen, once the heart of progress, began to collapse, their bodies too frail to rise again. Illness took a harsher toll in this desert stretch. Cholera spread swiftly, striking the already weakened. Its victims fell suddenly, their bodies racked with cramps, their strength drained in hours. Dysentery lingered still, leaving travelers too weak to walk. Fever burned in the heat, leaving the sick delirious, their eyes unfocused, their bodies trembling. Graves, dug shallow in the dry soil, dotted the trail with increasing frequency. Sometimes the earth was too hard to dig, and stones were piled instead, rough cairns standing as the only markers of lives lost. Quarrels grew sharper under the weight of thirst. Families accused one another of hoarding water, of hiding food, of slowing the train with weakness. Voices rose in anger, sometimes ending in blows, sometimes in silence heavier than violence. A few wagons broke away again, seeking alternate paths, though few believed they would survive alone. The Oregon Trail revealed itself once more as a trial not only of nature but of human will, testing how much trust could endure when survival demanded suspicion. And yet the emigrants pressed on. At night, when the sun finally fell, the air cooled sharply, carrying with it a strange relief. The stars burned brighter than ever, sharp and cold in the dark sky. Families huddled close around small fires, their faces lit by embers, their voices hushed. Hymns rose again, trembling but steady, carried into the silence of the desert night. Children fell asleep to these songs, clutching what little comfort remained. Parents, though hollow with hunger, whispered stories of Oregon, green valleys, wide rivers, orchards heavy with fruit. Those stories, fragile and desperate, kept hope alive when the body itself seemed ready to surrender. The desert was both cruel and beautiful. By day it was a furnace, by night a vast ocean of stars. Its silence pressed against the emigrants, sometimes unbearable, sometimes awe-inspiring. It reminded them of their smallness, their fragility, their place in a world that cared nothing for their suffering. And still, they walked. Each step forward was a rebellion against the land, a refusal to yield, a testament to the stubborn flame of human will. By this point, the Oregon Trail had claimed so much: lives, health, possessions, innocence. Yet the emigrants carried on, their bodies broken, their spirits battered, but their resolve unbroken. They no longer moved with the vigor of hope, but with the grim determination of necessity. For to stop was to die, and to die was to betray the dream that had carried them this far. So they pressed forward, into the desert, into the dust, toward the faint promise that somewhere beyond this wasteland, green land waited still. By the 19th stretch of the journey, the emigrants had left the worst of the barren desert behind. only to find themselves facing new hardships that tested their remaining strength in ways they had not anticipated. The land shifted once again. Rolling hills, thickets of forest, rivers that cut across the trail like silver barriers. After weeks of heat and thirst, the sound of rushing water should have been a blessing. Yet on the Oregon Trail, even blessings came with teeth. The rivers here were wide and swift, their banks treacherous, their depths deceptive. To cross them required courage and sacrifice. Wagons were corked and floated like crude rafts, their frames swaying dangerously as currents pulled against them. Oxen swam clumsily, their heavy bodies dragged downstream while men shouted and struck the water, urging them forward. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide with terror as wagons lurched and swayed, water lapping at the sides. Sometimes they made it safely to the opposite bank, laughter breaking through in relief. But too often the river claimed what it wanted, supplies swept away, animals drowned, or worse, a human life swallowed whole in the rushing dark. Every crossing left its mark. Families mourned quietly on the far banks, staring at the water that had taken so much. Some buried their dead on the river's edge, their graves watched over by the endless current. Others had no bodies to bury at all, only memories of a face vanishing beneath the water. The trail pressed on regardless, indifferent to loss. The emigrants, weary and numb, learned to harden themselves further, their grief carried silently as they yoked oxen once more. The forests, though filled with life, offered their own difficulties. Dense stands of pine and fir slowed progress, their roots tangling beneath the wheels, their branches tearing at wagon covers. Woodcutting became a daily necessity, axes ringing through the air as men cleared paths, their arms sore and blistered from constant labor. Fires burned brighter now with plentiful fuel, but even this came at a cost. More hours of toil, more sweat spilled into the soil. The emigrants knew by now that the trail never gave without taking something in return. Food remained scarce, though the forests offered occasional relief. Hunters brought back deer or elk, their carcasses dragged into camp with triumphant exhaustion. Meat roasted over fires filled the air with rich scents, a rare comfort that lifted spirits for a night. But such successes were not constant. More often, the hunters returned empty-handed, and meals reverted to thin bread, bitter roots, or whatever scraps remained in barrels. Hunger still gnawed, and the emigrants never forgot how quickly plenty turned back to scarcity. Illness continued its steady march. Fevers persisted, coughs lingered, and weakness haunted every step. Graves still appeared along the trail, though now they stood shaded by trees rather than exposed on plains or desert. Wooden crosses leaned against trunks, their names fading quickly beneath weather and time. For each family that rejoiced at finding fresh water or wild game, another lowered a loved one into the earth, their grief muffled by necessity. The trail did not allow long mourning. It demanded movement above all. Conflicts within the wagon train deepened further. Decisions about river crossings, food distribution, and hunting routes sparked fierce arguments. Trust eroded, suspicion thrived. Some families accused others of taking more than their share, of hunting in secret, of hoarding supplies. Voices rose, and fists sometimes followed. Leaders struggled to keep order, their authority weakened by exhaustion and hunger. Yet the truth remained plain to all. Unity was fragile, but survival without it was impossible. So, reluctantly, they endured one another still, bound by necessity even as bitterness simmered. And yet, even in the forests and rivers, beauty lingered. At dawn, mist clung to the trees, curling in pale ribbons through the valleys. Sunlight filtered through branches, painting the world in shades of gold. Birds called across the silence, their songs startling in their brightness after so many days of dust and death. Children, even gaunt and weary, chased one another through the trees, their laughter fleeting but real. Parents watched with tired smiles, reminded that life still clung fiercely to them, that not everything had been swallowed by hardship. At night, the company gathered by brighter fires than they had known in weeks, their faces lit by flames that snapped and leapt high. Songs rose again, fuller now, their voices echoing through the trees. Some prayed with renewed fervour, believing the forests meant they had crossed into land closer to their goal. Others sang simply to keep despair at bay, their voices weaving together into something stronger than hunger or grief. For a little while the forest seemed to cradle them, offering not only wood and shelter, but a fragile sense of belonging. Still, the emigrants knew better than to believe their journey was nearly over. The trail had taught them that every reprieve hid another trial, every valley led to another ridge, every comfort demanded a cost. Oregon lay ahead still, but the miles between remained vast and uncertain. And so, with hearts weary but unbroken, they pressed on through the rivers, the forests, the shadowed valleys, clinging to the fragile hope that soon, beyond the next rise, the land of promise would finally appear. By the 20th stretch of the journey, the emigrants were at the edge of the final promise. After months of dust storms, deserts, and mountains, the land began to change in ways that whispered of an ending. The air grew gentler, the rivers clearer, the valleys greener. Wildflowers bloomed along the roadside, and birds filled the trees with restless song. It was as if the world itself was reminding the weary souls that not all journeys were endless, that beyond suffering there could still be renewal. Yet the approach to Oregon was not free of trials. The last miles carried the weight of everything endured. Bodies were gaunt and worn, faces hollow, eyes shadowed by grief and exhaustion. Every emigrant bore scars, some on skin, others deeper, unseen but permanent. They had buried loved ones along the way, abandoned belongings, sacrificed animals, surrendered comfort and innocence. What remained was something forged by fire, a determination stripped bare of illusion, hardened by necessity. The final rivers tested them once more. Broad and swift, they demanded crossings that seemed almost cruel, as though the trail itself wished to claim one last toll before releasing them. Families lashed wagons together, prayed as they pushed into the current, and held their breath as the waters threatened to overturn everything they had left. Some lost supplies, a few lost lives, but most emerged dripping, trembling, gasping with relief on the far banks, and when they looked back, they did not weep. They had no tears left for what the rivers took. The land beyond began to open, rolling into valleys so rich with grass that oxen lifted their heads as though sensing release. Streams trickled clear and cold, washing away the dust of deserts and the bitterness of thirst. Forests thickened with pine and cedar, their shadows cool and fragrant. The emigrants, broken as they were, felt something stir within them, something long buried under hunger and fear. It was hope, cautious but undeniable, blooming again like green shoots after winter. At night, the campfires burned brighter. The songs, though still weary, carried tones of joy. Hymns rose with new conviction, voices trembling less with despair and more with gratitude. Parents spoke to their children of farms to be built, of fields to be ploughed, of orchards to be planted. The children, their bodies still thin, smiled faintly, their eyes bright with the promise of rest. Even those who had doubted most deeply found themselves speaking of tomorrow, of a future beyond the trail. When the Willamette Valley finally came into view, it was not with the thunder of trumpets or the blaze of glory. It was quiet. A wide, fertile land stretched before them, its rivers glistening, its meadows lush, its forests tall. The emigrants stood in silence, their bodies too weary for celebration, their hearts too full for words. They had made it. Not all, but enough. Those who had survived stood as living proof of endurance, their presence a testament to the strength that had carried them mile after mile. They remembered the graves behind them, the markers leaning in the wind on the plains, the stones piled in the desert, the cairns in the mountains, the nameless mounds by the rivers. Each step forward had been carried on the backs of those who had fallen. Each victory was shadowed by loss. And yet, standing at the edge of Oregon, the emigrants knew that their suffering had not been in vain. They had carved their way across a continent, through every cruelty the land could offer, and they had arrived. Life in Oregon would not be easy. The land would demand labor, the soil would resist, the winters would bite. But compared to the trail, it was paradise. Here there was water, clean and plentiful. Here there was soil, rich and dark. Here there were forests for timber, rivers for fish, valleys for fields. For the first time in months, perhaps years, the emigrants could imagine not just survival, but living. That night, as the first fires were lit in the valley, the emigrants gathered one last time as travelers before they became settlers. They sang together, voices stronger than they had been in weeks, the sound carrying into the dark like a hymn of survival. Children laughed softly, chasing fireflies among the wagons. Parents clasped hands, their faces illuminated by flame, eyes shining with both sorrow and triumph. Above them, the stars burned bright and cold, as they had on every night of the trail. But here, beneath them, the people were changed. The Oregon Trail had not been merely a road. It had been a crucible. It had burned away illusion, stripped down flesh and spirit alike, and revealed the raw, unyielding core of human will. Many had fallen. Many had been lost to dust and stone and water, but those who endured carried within them a story etched deeper than words, a story of hunger, grief, courage, and persistence. And so they stepped into Oregon, not as the same people who had left Missouri. They were scarred, they were hardened, they were haunted, but they were alive. And in their survival, they carried the unspoken truth that the Oregon Trail itself had taught them, that life, no matter how fragile, could endure the harshest of journeys, so long as hope, however faint, still burned within the human heart.